Everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about market structure and market power. In particular, the way in which market power and market structure are going to interact relevant for pricing. So I want to think carefully about how pricing is going to look under these different sorts of arrangements. So we'll think about monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, and then we'll think about setting prices given market power. In the later video, then I'll think about the problems associated with market power and then some public policy responses to try to deal with market power. So the basic thing we want to do is we want to think about carefully what the market structure, what the environment that a firm's operating in is going to look like. So this is really important. The market structure, the balance of firms, their relative strength, what products they're offering, this is all relevant for thinking about market power, which is basically the degree to which firms are able to influence pricing, right? So market power is the extent to which a seller can charge a higher price without losing sales to competing businesses. So the first thing is we realize with any price changes, we're going to follow the law of demand, and we want to think really carefully about the firm's individual demand curve and what happens when they charge a higher price. Well, they'll see a larger quantity or smaller quantity demanded, and some of those consumers will go to rivals. That's what we mean when you're losing sales. What's going to happen? Are those consumers switching to rival businesses or not? Also, we can think of market power as simply referring to a situation where the firm has the ability to influence or search out or determine what's going to be the highest possible price. And so it brings in the sort of issue of like optimizing as well. All right, so there's a few different type of market structures. So perfect competition, we've seen that already. Monopoly, that's just a single firm in the market. Oligopoly, this is where you'd have several firms, maybe like 2, 3, 4, 5, each of which could have been a monopoly in their own right. And then monopolistic competition, and this is where you have many firms and they all have some degree of market power. The only way that can happen is if there's substantial product differentiation. So now what I'll do is I'll consider each of those. I'll consider each of those sort of delineations between market structure that I've just introduced. So first, perfect competition. So markets that are perfectly competitive have many buyers and many sellers, all of an identical product. So we're thinking about homogeneous products, no product differentiation. And that means that there's really no, at the product level, incentive for consumers to buy from a different producer. There's many sellers, many buyers, each small relative to the size of the market. So there's not a buyer who's able to buy up enough to be able to move the price, nor are there sellers who are selling enough to be able to influence the price. The sellers have no market power, and actually the buyers don't have any buyer power either. With monopoly, we have a monopolistic market, well, involving a single seller, right? So we have a situation where basically the firm is going to serve the entire demand. So the firm's individual demand is the market demand curve and vice versa. Here you've got a seller with a lot of market power. And this is actually, Professor Wolfers puts this like this. These are like the textbook slides. The reason why I want to use the textbook slides is because I want, for the online version, I want a lot of consistency between the lecture, between the slides, and between the book. And otherwise, like I'd intersperse a lot of my slides that are in my other intermediate or introductory micro playlist. I would actually probably would have taught this lecture from that series, but I want things to be super uniform for the online version. The slides here are typically ones that I think Professor Wolfers made them, but they're not typically the ones that he'll use in class. And usually when I'll teach using, when I try to teach close to the book, I've got Professor Wolfers' slides, regular lecture slides. This slide deck actually is really close, actually really, really close to what we'd actually teach with. So anyway, so here we've got this zipper, and it's got this YKK on it. And look and see, like try to find, so look around, I don't know, check to see if you've got a zipper on, like you have I've got this nice sort of quarter zip pullover that I run in. I got the zippers like on the side of my Michigan economics jacket, and pants zippers as well, backpack. Like check a number of different zippers, and probably they've got this YKK because you've got a monopoly in that industry, right? Oligopolistic markets are interesting. Now you've got a handful of markets. You've got a handful of large firms in a single market, and typically thinking about a relatively identical product, though there could be some degree of product differentiation. So good example of oligopoly. This is an oligopoly. So this is like T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, and Sprint. One of the sort of hallmarks of oligopoly competition is that you've got like a couple of strong firms that everybody can think of. They all come to mind pretty readily. And in their advertisement, they'll mention their rivals. And so if like on my YouTube, if you search for oligopoly, I walk through like this advertisement. There's an interesting episode where T-Mobile had made an advertisement in early January of, I think it's 2014, trying to recruit AT&T customers to switch to T-Mobile, and it was specifically calling out AT&T customers. And then AT&T followed up with an ad responding to T-Mobile, specifically calling back those from T-Mobile. And so anyway, this only happens in an oligopolistic market where you'd mention your rival, because in oligopoly, it's actually some interesting strategy between the firms as well as thinking about customers. Monopolistic competition, now you've got product differentiation. So these are markets where you've got lots of small businesses, typically kind of competing, selling differentiated products. It doesn't necessarily need to be like small business in the usual sense. So usually we might think of like the local restaurant market as being monopolistically competitive. You might think of like local fast food as monopolistically competitive to some extent, although at the nationwide level, it looks a little bit more like an oligopoly. So you could think of like the names that would come to mind. Well, you get something that looks a little bit like monopolistic competition at the local level, because often there's franchising, and so the individual locations might be owned by different people who are all subject to kind of whatever the corporate pricing policies and menu items and so on and so forth. But you actually do have something that looks a little bit more like lots of different businesses operating in like a local food market. Anyway, so the basic idea with monopolistic competition, those are thinking about product differentiation. So now you've got sellers who are trying to make their products sufficiently different from rivals so that they're able to carve out a niche in the market. All right, so these sellers have some degree of market power, reinforced by the degree to which that product differentiation is relevant to their minds of their consumers. All right, so now the way that Professor Wolfers likes to teach us, and the way that I like to teach this as well, which differs from a lot of other introductory levels, is to kind of say, okay, cool, we've got these market structures that everybody likes to pay attention to: perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. But in the real world, we've got kind of actually just a lot of imperfect competition, things kind of in the middle. And so we actually think a lot of like perfect competition at one end having very little market power, monopoly at the other end having quite a bit of market power, and then everything in the middle, we just call that imperfect competition. This is sort of a more realistic way to kind of think about the markets and the industry structures around us. As a matter of fact, you won't find very many markets that are perfectly competitive. You can maybe argue that the local, like a local farmer's market for sweet corn or something, looks pretty perfectly competitive, and you check our assumptions for perfect competition and you're not too far off. There's not a lot of things that are perfectly a monopoly. Like you could argue that maybe the utilities, indeed there's arguably like natural monopolies, which speaks to the cost structure. A natural monopoly is one where the cost of operating in that industry sort of selects, like think of like Darwin and natural selection, selects optimally for one firm. This is particularly where there's a large fixed cost of operating and a really low marginal cost of serving an additional consumer, maybe near zero. And so that's maybe the most compelling case where you'd have like a true monopoly. Although like there's other kind of historic monopolies, maybe if you have control of a scarce input or so on and so forth, you could have examples where you have things, or like Microsoft has 95% of the share of the operating system market in the late 90s, was kind of a monopoly. But, you know, so we don't typically have like what you'd think of as like the quintessential monopoly or the quintessential perfectly competitive market. Instead, you have kind of a spectrum. So that's why this is kind of the best way to think about it. And this doesn't mean that perfect competition or monopoly are like ridiculous or useless models. There are starting points. And you think about, okay, what would be like the sort of textbook monopoly and what would be like the textbook perfect competition? And then how does a given business, how does a given example fit with one or the other or something in the middle, right? And so that's what this is useful for, is you want to think about our assumptions for the economics for giving us our bearings. We want to understand, and like there's test questions. You want to think about like understanding inside and out the theory around a monopoly and theory around perfect competition. But I want you to understand that the value of that is for comparison to real world examples and getting our bearings as like landmarks for navigating, like a map example, rather than like you're not going to go and find examples of perfect competition and monopoly out there in the wilderness, but that's not the point. Okay. All right. So I want to think carefully about market power as the important dimension. So if there's many competitors, then you probably have not very much market power. If there's no competitors, you have a lot of market power. Or if you have an identical product, there's not very much market power. But if you have a unique product, there's a lot of market power. And so you could think of the ways that firms can try to get more market power. Well, try to choose a niche where there's fewer competitors, and then do things to limit competition. Now, that's got to be done carefully, because if you're exploiting monopoly power with the purpose of limiting competition, now you've done something that's probably going to run afoul of antitrust. However, one thing you could do to limit competition that wouldn't be illegal is just like making your own investments in quality that'd be difficult for an entrant to match, right? So make bigger hurdles for a rival to be able to counter before they'd be able to be able to capture any market power or market share, or having an increasingly unique product. All right, so the market structure determines the market power. The structure with the least market power, that's perfect competition. At the other extreme, we have monopolies. Both perfect competition and monopoly are really rare. Most businesses operate in imperfectly competitive markets. So this is where you have at least some competitors and sell products that are at least a little bit different from those of competitors. And that's what we kind of see most typically. All right, so which of the following has the most market power? It's monopoly, right? This is some of the questions in here are a little bit better. That was kind of a silly question. That's kind of like, are you paying attention? Okay, so yeah. All right, so 5 key insights into imperfect competition. The following insights set the agenda for the rest of our study of business strategy. Ultimately, we're going to be interested in thinking about kind of strategies for working with market power and for pricing. All right, so market power allows you to pursue independent pricing strategies. Having more competitors, less market power, kind of by definition. Successful product differentiation gives you more product power. Imperfect competition among buyers gives them bargaining power. And then your best choice depends on the actions that the other businesses make. So I want to think carefully about these. All right, so we can assess the market power of the various sellers. Well, so here's like Verizon, and then cable company or broadband provider. That's kind of actually a lot of market power. Like close to oligopoly, close to monopoly once you've signed on with a particular company, because there's switching costs. Matter of fact, in some areas, you might only have 1 or 2 to choose from. Maybe you only have 2 choices for cable or 2 choices for internet or something like that. And so that could be a big issue. iPhone, so competes with the Android. Well, this is a little bit more product differentiation and a little bit more market power in that sense, but there's also like relatively strong rivals. And so this tends to situations where maybe there's a little bit less market power. Certainly less market power than the case of cable and broadband. What about selling concert tickets through StubHub? Well, now individual sellers don't have much market power at all, except maybe within a section if there's like a particular view. So sometimes like if I go to see a new venue, sometimes I like to look at reviews and try to figure out like where's going to be the best place to sit. And then maybe I only want seats in those in that section if I think that I'm doing 2 things. One, I'm seeing that performer, but also I'm seeing that particular venue, and I might not be back to that venue, which might be interesting to see. And so that would be the one place where there might be a little bit, if we're thinking about some tickets being a little bit better than others. Okay. So then we want to think about setting prices when you have market power. Calculate the best price to sell when you set at and sell at when you have market power. All right. So how to maximize profit? Well, there's a trade-off between price and quantity. That's coming from the law of demand, right? If you sell a large quantity, there's going to be a lower average price. If you're going to sell if you're going to try to make more money in each item, sell with a higher price premium, you're going to sell fewer items. You can use the demand curve and then our understanding of law of demand to get our bearings. And then ultimately the marginal revenue curve, which is derived from the demand curve, helps us evaluate this trade-off Oh, marginal revenue. Yeah, we're probably going to compare marginal benefit to marginal cost. Yes, you're right. That's exactly the logic. So the firm demand curve gives us, again, the quantity that buyers are going to demand from an individual firm as it's changing its price. The firm's market demand is going to be the quantity demanded across all firms. And the market demand, I said firm. The market demand is quantity demanded across all firms. The firm demand is the quantity demanded from your firm. And then the individual demand is the quantity demanded from a single buyer. Your market power shapes your firm's demand curve, right? And ultimately, if you have maximal market power, then your firm demand and market demand are the same. And that's sort of the goal. All right, so here's the firm's demand curve depending on the face of the competition or the competition that you face. So market type, here's your competitors. Perfect competition has many competitors. Monopolistic competition has many. Oligopoly has few. Monopoly has no competitors. In terms of product, they're all selling the same product. Imperfect competition, differentiated product. Oligopoly could be same or different. Tends to be a little bit differentiation, but minimally differentiate. And then monopoly is unique product. Yeah, the most market power is in that direction. All right. Oops, I need to make this a little bit smaller to be able to click through. All right. The least market power, when there's no market power, raising your price a penny means the market above the market price means you won't sell anything because you're selling the same product for more. So people just go where they can buy it for less. So with perfect competition, we assume the firm demand curve is perfectly horizontal, indicating that it's perfectly elastic. You can sell as much as you want at the market price, but if you change the market price, that's not going to be good. Why? Oh, sorry. You can't change the market price. If you change your own selling price, that's not going to be good. If you change here's the market price. If you sell anything above or below the market price, fine, you'll capture the market, but now you're making a loss because we're assuming in perfect competition, price is set equal to marginal cost. If you charge above the market price, you lose all your customers. All right, so we have some market power. Here's your firm demand. It's going to be a little bit more elastic than the market demand. The market demand is, and so that's not the graph he's doing. Right. So the Professor Wolfers graph has the firm demand. If you have low market power, it's going to be more elastic. If you have lots of market power, it's going to be much more inelastic. So what I said before is correct. It just didn't match the graph. So if you're facing if you have a situation where you have a lot of market power, now you've got a more inelastic demand. You can interpret that as inelastic demand is where consumers have few alternatives. So if you have market power, consumers don't have many alternatives to buying from your firm. If you have very little market power, consumers have a lot of alternatives and they're going to choose them. They're going to be your rivals. And then if the market demand and firm demand is the same, this is like the monopoly. Your firm demand is the market demand curve. All right. So that is what this was doing. Which of the following has the flattest demand curve? Perfect competition, no question. By definition, it has the flat demand curve, right? Which has the steepest demand curve? Monopoly, no question, right? Okay, so good. Here's your firm demand curve. It's Leapfrog Phonics Traveler. Oh, cool. It's very, very unusual for me to reach an example and have no idea what it is, but okay. All right, so you can imagine we've got this firm who's selling whatever this thing is. We have to use Google later. So experiment with your price, determine your firm's price or your firm's demand curve. So managers could offer different prices to different consumers. Maybe they offer different prices at different locations, sometimes different prices over time. So you could try selling different prices and see what happens to the demand curve. So here we've got some experiment. This looks like at the highest price that was charged was $35 and maybe they sold like 15. And then the lowest price offered was 25 and they sold something that looks like 32. Okay. So this is downward sloping. This is just the firm's demand curve. All right. So we have Sophia running a Ford dealership in Nashville. When Sophia advertised the new Ford Focus at $23,000, Sophia sold 2 cars per week. When Sophia discounted the price to $22,000, Sophia sold 3 cars per week. Further discounting the price to $21,000 let Sophia sell 4 cars. I hope Sophia does. It says let. Yeah. Okay. Then let's assume sold 4 cars per week. All right. It's increasing Sophia's price to $24,000, assuming Sophia sells only 1 car per week. It shouldn't. I mean, why let? I'm not having any. I'm not. There's no way, shape, or form that I am influencing or I'm allowing Sophia, I hope Sophia the best, trying to sell these cars. All right. But it says let, so I don't know. Sorry, that's distracting. All right, so we can graph the demand curve for Sophia and the Ford Focus. It's going to be a downward sloping demand curve. Plot the results of Sophia's pricing to develop Sophia's demand. Okay, so we would put, let's see, we had at 23,000, we have 2, so we put a dot right here. At 22,000, we have 3, so we put a dot right here. And at 21,000, we have 4, we put a dot right here. Cool. All right, so good decisions focus on marginal revenue. Sophia comes back in the future. So marginal revenue is the additional contribution to total revenue from selling one more unit of the output. And you calculate the marginal revenue by looking at the change in total revenue when you sell one more unit. Marginal revenue is always going to be below the demand curve. If you're talking about a linear equation, marginal revenue has the same vertical intercept and exactly twice the slope. That's just an anecdote. That's just an aside. We don't need to worry about that for this class here at this point. I've got some videos that reinforce. I talk about if you Google like if you go to YouTube and then search for marginal revenue on my channel, you will find my different marginal revenue videos that explain it at several different levels, at the 101 level, at the intermediate micro level, for firms, for the market, for monopoly. But because there's always a lot of questions, students are always trying to determine why it's the case that the vertical intercept is the same for the marginal revenue curve, but the slope is doubled. It has to do with the calculus of it and taking a derivative, but that's the most I want to say here because we don't really need it. All right, so use your firm demand curve to calculate your marginal revenue. First, calculate the total revenue. Your total revenue is simply the price you charge multiplied by the quantity you sell. Right, so remember, revenue is price times quantity, P times Q. So if I have a list of prices and I have a list of quantities, I can get the total revenue just by multiplying. 24,000 times 1 is 24,000 is total revenue. 23,000 times 2 is 46,000. 66,000, 84,000. Right, that's just total revenue. Here's my demand curve, just plotting. All right, good. So we've got that. We've got a firm demand curve. Right, so we have Sophia. Good. Now we've got marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is the change in total revenue when you sell one additional unit of output. So so how are we getting this marginal revenue? Now, a couple things. So in the calculus class, you take the derivative, and the first derivative with respect to the choice variable, such as like quantity, gives you the derivative, gives you the slope of the line, of the line tangent at that point. Turns out the derivative of the total revenue function is just marginal revenue. So if you had a linear equation, you just take the derivative and then evaluate that particular quantity, and that would give you the marginal revenue. We don't need to worry about that here. I just like to mention that because we need to make these connections, because the linking up the math to the economics, when you're ready for it, ultimately provides a lot more insights. We're not ready for that just yet. For marginal revenue here, to get marginal revenue, it's just the change in total revenue with one additional unit of output. No calculus. Let's just take total revenue for selling 2 minus total revenue from selling 1. Oh, that's our 22,000. Total revenue for selling 3 minus my total revenue for selling 2. Oh, that's 20,000. Total revenue for selling 4 minus my total revenue for selling 3. That's 18,000, right? Marginal revenue is just the additional unit or additional revenue from selling one more unit of output. All right, we can plot the marginal revenue curve. As I said, demand and marginal revenue are going to have the same vertical intercept. It's got to right here. And then it ends up having the marginal revenue curve ends up actually having twice the slope. That's if we go all the way down and extend this to the horizontal intercept. That's not showing up here. We don't worry about that anymore. The key insight that we need, though, is that the marginal revenue curve is always lying below the demand curve. Excuse me, sorry. All right, so that's going to be relevant for this discussion. Marginal revenue. So you're thinking about how is total revenue changing when we sell one additional unit of output? Well, okay, I'm going to kind of talk about this on the slide, but let me go through the logic first. Let's kind of step away from the slide for a second. Remember, total revenue is price times quantity. And remember, those are both parameters on the demand curve. And then remember, we've got the law of demand. So when you change the price, you get a smaller or larger quantity depending on if you've increased or decreased the price. When you change the quantity, the price adjusts as well to be able to make the market clear. Now, we have two different things, therefore, acting on revenue, because revenue is just price times quantity. So suppose we sell one additional unit. If we sell one additional unit, right, the quantity is increased. That'll tend towards increasing revenue because we're selling more units. Revenue has been generated over more units. So that's going to tend towards increasing revenue. However, to be able to make that happen by the law of demand, the price had to fall. That's going to tend towards reducing revenue, right? If I sell one more unit, I'm receiving revenue over more output. I'm counting my revenue, receiving payment over more units, so my revenue should rise. But on the other hand, in order to do this, the price that I'm receiving on all those units had to fall. Those are the two competing effects, right? The output effect is the revenue increase from selling one more unit. The output effect is just going to be like the price, right? Whatever is the price, that's the increase in the revenue from selling an additional unit. The discount effect is the revenue lost from cutting the price on all the units sold. By the law of demand, when I sell one more unit, I reduce the price, but that price gets applied to all units sold. That's the discount effect. It's the change in price times the quantity, right? So marginal revenue then is, if we wanted to calculate it, it's the original price minus the reduced price over all the units. All right. So as you're seeing this, so the way that I like to teach this, I want you to understand the logic of the output effect. I want you to understand the logic of the discount effect. I don't find this equation right here that I've now highlighted particularly helpful. I don't even find that helpful in like the 401 class, in the intermediate micro class. And so if this helps you, cool. I want you to understand and appreciate this part of the slide. And then if you want to puzzle through this part, that's more than I've done, right? All right. So ultimately you're responsible for, like the way that I'd say this in a typical lecture, ultimately you're responsible for the content as presented in class and then reinforced by the course materials. Okay, so here's your firm demand curve. It's downward sloping. Here's the marginal revenue curve. It lies below the demand curve, and it always do that. And then it's falling down because of the discount effect, right? So the discount effect is the fact that on each additional unit, as I'm selling more, I'm getting less. The price is going to be smaller to make these sales, right? The marginal revenue curve declines more sharply as your firm demand, because the larger the quantity you sell, the larger the discount effect, right? The discount effect, I have to, relative to the price that I was selling here, I have to discount quite a bit more to sell additional units by the law of demand. And then what's happening is the difference between the price. So here's the way to kind of explain this conceptually. If I'm at the very top of the demand curve and I want to sell an additional unit, I have to sell it for a little bit less, okay? Not only am I selling that unit for less, I'm selling all previous units for a little bit less. But that's not that much of a discount over that first unit. However, when I get down to the bottom of the demand curve, to sell all these units, I have to lower the price quite a bit, but I also have to lower the price on the first unit. So that becomes a relatively large discount, right? So I'm discounting pretty substantially by the time that I'm selling a large number of units relative to where I would have been initially, right? And so I'm lowering the price substantially to be able to sell more units. That's why the marginal revenue curve is falling, because I'm making less on each additional unit that I'm selling. And the gap is widening and widening as I have to discount deeper and deeper to be able to make those additional sales. Okay. So how do sellers determine their price and quantity? Well, you're going to keep selling until your marginal revenue curve equals your marginal cost. Graphically, we just look to see where does marginal revenue cross marginal cost. That quantity is the monopoly's optimal quantity. Then you go up to the demand curve to find the optimal price. Prices come from demand curves. But in terms of the logic here, remember, we have a rational rule for sellers. It tells us to sell an additional item. We want to sell an additional item when the marginal revenue is bigger than the marginal cost. Then you want to set your price on the demand curve, not on the marginal revenue curve. Right, so how many cars should Sophia sell? And then what price should Sophia charge? Well, what quantity should we produce? We'll use the rational rule. We'll keep producing as long as the marginal revenue is bigger than marginal cost, and stop selling when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Look, so the optimal quantity is 3, but the important thing, so don't just dismiss the graph immediately and say, oh, I can see where it crosses, it's 3, and then we're done. I want you to build the logic. So the logic is, over these first 3 units, look, the marginal revenue curve lies higher. It's vertically higher than the marginal cost curve. And because the vertical height corresponds to the marginal revenue, this tells us that the marginal revenue is higher than the marginal cost. The vertical height here corresponds, as measured from the horizontal axis, the vertical height is the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost. Here it's positive, right? So there's economic surplus. And then here, what's happening? The marginal cost is now higher, vertically higher, but then also numerically higher than marginal revenue. That tells us that as I'm selling more and more, I'm gaining, right? Profits are rising as I sell more and more up to this point. Now profits are falling because in each additional unit, my cost is higher than the marginal revenue. That's the important lesson to take from the graph. The other issue is where marginal revenue crosses marginal cost, that gives us the optimal quantity. Now we have to go to the demand curve to find the price. So prices come from demand curve. So we evaluate my demand at the price, at the quantity of 3, find my market price. It's 22,000. Mistake that sometimes students will make is write down essentially the profit maximizing price as 20,000. That's a kind of a common mistake. It's a common mistake both in Econ 101 and the principles level class, like making the mistake of just forgetting and just saying, oh, we'll find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That gives me my quantity, and then, 20,000. No, that's wrong. Find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then go up to the demand curve. Prices come from demand curves to find the price, right? The mistake that people would make in intermediate level in the 401 class is just with equations, forgetting to evaluating instead the marginal revenue curve at the quantity they found instead of the demand curve. Okay, so once again, prices come from demand curves, which means once you found the place where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, you want to find what's the price associated with that quantity, right? That's kind of the key detail. Okay, and then now hopefully you won't make the mistake. I always I try to foreshadow as much as possible. It's effective, I know it is, because sometimes I see in the margin you'll write, and I won't see it for an online test, but for a normal semester, I'll see on the margins, you write in quotes, prices come from demand curves. And then that's cool to see, because then I'm oh, maybe this is somebody that I've potentially rescued from losing points from doing this otherwise kind of easy to make mistake. Okay, so calculate the weekly profits Sophia will make for each price and quantity. Does the rational rule for sellers lead Sophia to the optimal price? Sure enough, yeah, let's compare marginal revenue to marginal cost. Where did marginal cost come from? It was flat. It was horizontal at 20,000. So that's why marginal cost is the same. It's constant across these units. Constant marginal cost means same marginal cost at all units. So I'm basically just looking to see, where's marginal revenue going to be equal to 20,000? It's right here. It's 3. Yeah, this is going to be the profit maximizing outcome. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that the profit maximizing point, the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, might not be exactly equal here, might not be 20,000 and 20,000. So for instance, what if this dropped from say 21,000 to say 19,000? And then maybe marginal cost rose from say, let's say 19,000 to 20,000, right? So then it was revenue was 19,000, 20,000, cost was 20,000, revenue was 20,000, 19,000, cost was 19,000, 20,000. So that they'd kind of cross, and the profit maximizing place would be in the middle. Then wherever it would be the closest quantity, that'd be the one you'd select. Rational rule is going to tell us you don't want to produce beyond the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So if the table you're looking at only has the point where marginal revenue is bigger than marginal cost, and then the next point is where marginal cost is bigger than marginal revenue, you don't produce that next quantity. You stop before you reach that point. All right, that's the other kind of important thing that I want to be able to convey. All right, practice question. What's the relationship among marginal revenue, marginal cost, and price in a firm with market power? Oh, it's marginal cost equals marginal revenue, but it's less than the price. This is actually the condition for a monopoly. Check your understanding. How is this different for a competitive firm? What would we get for the competitive market? Suppose I wasn't asking for a firm with market power. Suppose I was asking for a firm with no market power. Answer would be A. This is what it would be for competition, right? Okay. And then the next video, we'll think about the problems with market power and then assessing government or policy response. All right. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.